Imagine a warm Texas evening, the kind where the air hums with cicadas and the sky stretches wide and endless. That's where our story begins, not with a bang, but with a young woman named Emily Rose Carter, who, on September 7th, 2009, was just living her life, chasing her dreams, and heading home after a night out. Emily was 27, bright-eyed and determined, the sort of person you'd want as a friend or teacher. But that night, something went horribly wrong, and what started as a routine drive home spiraled into a mystery that would grip everyone who heard it. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened, you've got to know who Emily was. Emily came into the world on May 8, 1982, in Austin, Texas, a city buzzing with music, culture, and possibility. She grew up there with her parents and two younger brothers, a tight-knit family who later traded the city lights for the quiet streets of a little town called Harper. It was one of those places where everyone knows your name, and Emily fit right in. She had this warmth about her, a friendliness that drew people close without her even trying. Picture her laughing at a picnic or chatting with neighbors over a fence. It was just who she was. But don't let that fool you into thinking she was all soft edges. Emily had fire in her too. Even as a teenager, she knew exactly what she wanted. To be a teacher, to shape young minds and make a difference. That dream wasn't just a whim, it was a plan. After high school, she packed her bags and headed to Texas State University, where she threw herself into her studies. She earned a bachelor's degree in science, but she didn't stop there. Emily was the kind of person who saw a mountain and kept climbing. She enrolled in a master's program, determined to solidify her path to the classroom. Money was tight, though student loans don't pay themselves, so she juggled jobs to keep the bills at bay. By day, she was a teaching assistant at a local elementary school, guiding kids through their lessons with that same easy smile. By night, she worked part-time at a grocery store, stocking shelves and ringing up customers. It was grueling, but Emily never complained. She'd tell you all that hard work was just a stepping stone, a means to the life she envisioned. Fast forward to September 2009, and Emily was still balancing that whirlwind of a scheduled grad school 2 jobs, and a flicker of hope that soon she'd land a full-time teaching gig. At 27, she was close, so close, to making it all pay off. Her friends would tease her about burning the candle at both ends, but she'd just shrug and say, "It'll be worth it." And you know what? You believed her, because Emily had that spark, something that made you root for her. Now, let's zoom in on that fateful day, September 7th. It was a rare day off from her packed routine, and Emily decided to spend it with the people she loved. She kicked things off with her cousin Sarah and a few friends, lounging by the pool under the late summer sun. The water was cool, the laughter loud, and for a few hours, life felt light. Later, they grabbed dinner, nothing fancy, just good food and better company. Before heading to a local bar, they played pool, sipped drinks, and let the night stretch on. Emily, ever the responsible one, volunteered as a designated driver. She'd had a long day already, but she wanted to make sure everyone got home safe. That's just how she was, always looking out for others. By the time the group started winding down, it was late. Nearing 1:30 a.m., Emily dropped off her friends one by one, her cousin Sarah being the last. They pulled up to Sarah's place, and Sarah, still buzzing from the night, offered her a spot on the couch. "Stay over," she said. "It's late." But Emily shook her head. "I've got an early shift at the store tomorrow," she replied, her voice firm but kind. "Plus, I need to grab some food for the dogs. They're probably starving by now." Sarah didn't push. She knew Emily was stubborn when it came to her responsibilities. So they hugged goodnight, and Emily drove off into the dark, her taillights fading as she turned the corner. That's the last time anyone saw her alive and well. Or so they thought at the time. A few hours later, as dawn crept over Harper, Sarah's phone rang. It was one of Emily's co-workers in the grocery store, her voice edged with worry. "Emily didn't show up for her shift," she said. Now, if you knew Emily, you'd know this was a red flag the size of Texas. She'd just been promoted to store manager, a role she took seriously. Missing work? Not calling in? That wasn't her. Sarah's stomach dropped. She started dialing friends, hoping someone had heard from her cousin, but no one had. Next, she called Emily's brother, Michael, who shared an apartment with her. Michael was a police officer, already out on his 5:30 a.m. shift, and he hadn't seen Emily either. "I didn't check her room before I left," he admitted, his tone tightening. "I just assumed she was asleep." Concern turned to panic fast. Michael raced home, his patrol car cutting through the sleepy streets. When he got there, the apartment was eerily quiet. Emily's room was empty, her bed untouched. Worse, her dogs, two scruffy much she adored, were pacing, whining like they hadn't eaten in hours. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio and called his colleagues at the Harper Police Department. "Track her phone," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Now." And that's where the story takes its first dark turn. The signal led them to a restaurant parking lot not far from the apartment, a place Emily passed every day. Sarah and her boyfriend sped over, hoping for answers, but what they found stopped them cold. There was Emily's car, sitting alone under the morning sun. They approached, hearts pounding, and when they opened the door, the sight hit them like a punch. Emily was slumped in the driver's seat, motionless, her skin blistered with sunburns. The air inside was suffocating, thick with heat. Sarah screamed for help, but it was already too late. What happened to Emily Rose Carter that night? How did a woman so full of life end up like this? That's what the police and everyone who loved her were desperate to figure out. But as they'd soon discover, the truth was stranger and more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Stick with me, because this is just the beginning. So, there we were. Emily Rose Carter's car sitting in that restaurant parking lot, the morning sun beating down, and Sarah staring at her cousin's lifeless body. It's the kind of moment that freezes time, you know? 1 second. You're hoping for a simple explanation. Maybe she fell asleep, maybe she's just sick. And the next, you're face to face with something so awful it doesn't even compute. Sarah's boyfriend fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaky hands, while she just stood there, tears streaming, whispering, "No, no, no." The police and an ambulance arrived fast. Michael's call had already put them on high alert, but the paramedics didn't waste time with false hope. One look at Emily and they knew. She was gone. Her body was whisked away for examination, leaving everyone with the same question. What the hell happened? Now, let's rewind just a bit, because the hours leading up to this are where the puzzle starts. After Emily left Sarah's place around 1:30 a.m., she'd planned to swing by a 24-hour store, probably Walmart crosstown, to grab food for her dogs. She'd mentioned it casually, like it was no big deal, just another errand on her endless to-do list. But somewhere between dropping Sarah off and that parking lot, everything went sideways. Michael, being a cop, didn't mess around. He'd already rallied his team to trace her phone, and when the signal pinged at that restaurant, it was a gut punch. It was so close to home. Too close. Sarah and her boyfriend beat the police there, and when they saw Emily's car, they didn't wait. They ran over, yanked the door open, and that's when the nightmare became real. Inside, Emily wasn't just still, she was wrong. Her skin was red and blistered, like she'd been baking in that car for hours. The heat was unbearable, even with the door open, and her body bore marks that told a story no one wanted to hear. Bruises, scratches. Something violent had happened here. The cops arrived minutes later, cordoning off the scene, and Michael showed up too, his face pale but his jaw set. He couldn't break down, not yet. He had a job to do, even if it was his little sister lying there. The medical examiner got to work fast, and what they found was chilling. Emily had been strangled, marks from hands, and maybe a rope or belt circled her throat. She'd been beaten, assaulted in ways that make your stomach turn, and left in that car under the Texas sun. The heat hadn't just burned her, it had cooked her alive, worsening a brain injury from the attack. That's what killed her, they said, a slow, brutal combo of trauma and exposure. But here's the kicker. The toxicology report came back clean. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing. Sarah had been right. Emily was stone cold sober that night. She'd driven everyone home responsibly, stuck to her plan, and still ended up like this. It didn't add up. Meanwhile, the detectives started piecing things together at the scene. Emily's car was a treasure trove of clues, even if they didn't all make sense right away. The driver's seat was shoved way back, too far for someone her size, which was barely 5'4". Someone else had been in there, someone bigger. Her keys, wallet, and credit card were gone, but a bag of dog food sat untouched on the back seat. That hit hard. She'd made it to the store, bought the food, and then what? The cops figured she'd been attacked right there in the car, maybe even driven to that parking lot by whoever did this. It was a theory, but they needed more. Then came the twist that turned everything upside down. The detectives headed into the restaurant nearby, hoping for witnesses, and struck gold. An employee, a young woman who'd opened up that morning, remembered seeing Emily's car when she arrived around 5 a.m. But here's the wild part. Emily was still alive then. The woman said she'd spotted Emily sitting inside, stark naked, acting all out of sorts, like she was drunk or high. It was weird, sure, but she didn't think much of it and went inside to start her shift. Later, she stepped out again, and Emily was outside the car, dressed now, running her hands through her hair like she was lost in her head. The third time, back in the car, talking to herself, waving her hands around. It was bizarre, and it got weirder. Other people saw her too, wandering, mumbling, alive for hours after whatever happened. But not one of them called for help. Not one. The cops circled back to Sarah, asking if Emily might have been on something. Booze, pills, anything. Sarah shut that down fast. She was a designated driver. She snapped. She had work in a few hours. Emily didn't mess around with that stuff. Ever. Her friends backed her up. Emily was a reliable one. The Rock. Drugs? No way. So what was going on? The medical examiner had an answer, and it was haunting. That brain injury from the strangulation, combined with the heat, could have scrambled her mind. She might have been so disoriented she didn't even know she needed help. Imagine that. Hurt, confused, stumbling around and no one steps in. If just one person had dialed 911, maybe she'd still be here. But they didn't, and now the cops had a murder to solve. They started digging deeper. No CCTV cameras caught the parking lot directly, but they knew Emily had hit that Walmart. The footage, there was her next stop, and it was gold. Around 2 a.m., there she was, pulling into the lot, walking in, grabbing dog food like it was any other night. She looked fine, normal, alone, but as she headed out, something caught the detective's eye. A man followed her, close, too close. He'd rolled up just before her, parked way at the back, and lingered inside, ducking into the restroom before trailing her out. The camera is lost behind a big tree near her car, but 2 minutes later, her car peeled out. Another camera picked it up arriving at the restaurant lot, and then a figure, blurry but deliberate, walked back to a red pickup truck in Walmart's lot. That was their guy. They could feel it. But who was he? The footage was too grainy to ID him, and his truck's plates were a blur. Still, they had a lead. Emily's credit cards were missing, and one popped up at a gas station 20 minutes later. The cameras there showed that same red pickup, and inside, a man at the register, clear as day. The cops had a face now, and they were closing in. Emily's story was about to take another sharp turn, one that would test everything they thought they knew. Hang tight, because this is where it gets intense. All right, so the cops had a face on camera, grainy, sure, but enough to work with, and a red pickup truck that was starting to feel like the key to unlocking this nightmare. Emily Rose Carter's death had already shaken Harper to its core, and now the detectives were racing against time to figure out who'd turned her ordinary night into a tragedy. That gas station footage? It was their golden ticket. 20 minutes after Emily's car landed in that restaurant parking lot, someone used her credit card to buy gas, and the guy behind the register matched the shadowy figure from Walmart. Same build, same vibe. The cops knew they were onto something big. But they needed a name. And trust me, what came next was a roller coaster. Let's back up a sec to that Walmart footage, because it painted a picture that wouldn't let go. Emily strolls in at 2 a.m., grabs the dog food, pays, and heads out business as usual. Then this guy trails her, keeping just enough distance to stay under the radar. He'd rolled into the lot minutes before her, parked way out by the edge like he didn't want to be seen, and ducked into the restroom instead of shopping. Suspicious? You bet. When Emily walks out, he's right behind her, moving fast. The camera's losing behind that damn tree, but then her car takes off, lands at the restaurant, and he's back in his truck, like clockwork. The detectives watch that tape over and over, piecing it together. This wasn't random. This guy had a plan. They plastered his face in that red pickup all over the news, local stations, papers, anywhere they could get eyes on it. If you know this man, call us, they said. Days ticked by with nothing solid. Just dead-end tips from people who thought every red truck was a clue. The pressure was mounting. Michael was barely sleeping. Sarah was a wreck, and the whole town was buzzing with theories. Then, out of nowhere, a woman named Rachel picked up the phone. She sounded nervous, hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should be talking. That guy on TV, she said, he looks like my fiancé's best friend. His name's Daniel Travis. Boom! There it was, the break they'd been praying for. Rachel spilled everything. Daniel was 29, a drifter type who'd been in and out of trouble. He was supposed to swing by her place that night to pay back some cash he owed her fiancé, but he never showed. Then she saw the news about Emily and nearly dropped her coffee. He was wearing the same baseball cap she'd seen him in a dozen times. I didn't want to believe it, she told the cops, but I couldn't ignore it. The detectives dug into Daniel's past and hit pay dirt. Weeks before Emily's murder, a patrol officer had pulled him over for an expired license. Body cam footage showed him. Same cap, same cocky smirk, and he was driving a red pickup that matched the one on tape. They had him in their sights now. 5 days after Emily was found, the cops rolled up to Daniel's place. That truck was parked out front, but it looked different. Chrome details from the footage were now painted black, like he'd tried to disguise it. Bold move, but sloppy. When they knocked, Daniel opened the door like he'd been expecting them. Calm as you please. Before they could even ask, he launched into a story. Yeah, I met her, he said. We hooked up. She found me on some adult website. Wanted a no-strings thing. We met at Walmart, went to a park, had some fun, consensual, all of it. She even gave me her credit card for gas. Next day, I saw the news and freaked. Dumped the card, painted the truck. Didn't want to get pinned for something I didn't do. He said it all with his smug confidence, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. The detectives weren't buying it. Not for a second. The footage shredded his story like wet paper. He claimed they planned to meet, but he never approached her until she was at her car. He said she drove him back after their date, but the cameras showed him walking to his truck alone. And that adult website? They seized his phone and computer. Cross-checked with Emily's devices. Nothing. No messages, no calls. Not even a browser history to back him up. Emily's friends and family piled on too. A random hookup? Sarah scoffed. She was exhausted, had work in the morning, and her dogs were waiting. That's not Emily. But Daniel's search history told another tale. Hours after her body was found, he'd been reading every article he could find about her death. Guilty much? Here's what they think really happened. Daniel spotted Emily in Walmart, saw an opportunity, and pounced. He followed her out, forced his way into her car, maybe with a threat, maybe a weapon, and made her drive to that park. There, he attacked her, strangled her, and took her stuff. Then he dumped her back at the restaurant lot, close to his truck, and split. The evidence was screaming his name, but when they laid it out, Daniel clammed up. I want a lawyer, he said, and that was that. They had him, right? Not so fast. The case at the wall, a weird medical one. Emily had lived for hours after the attack, walking, talking, acting strange. The strangulation didn't kill her outright. The brain injury and heat did her in later. That delayed death thing, it was so rare. There wasn't a single case study back it up. The prosecutor started sweating. If she was alive that long, he said, a jury might not connect the dots to murder. Without DNA, none in the car, none under her nails. They needed a confession, and Daniel wasn't budging. It was a legal mess, and they were stuck, so they pivoted. Daniel had admitted to tossing the card and painting the truck. Evidence tampering, clear as day. In May 2010, he pleaded guilty to that, landing 10 years in prison. It wasn't justice, not really, but it bought time. The cops weren't done, not by a long shot. They were obsessed, determined to nail him for Emily's murder, no matter how long it took. And just when it seemed like the trail was going cold, a breakthrough was waiting around the corner. One that would change everything. You're not going to believe what they found next. The next couple of days felt like walking through quicksand. Every step heavier, every thought darker. After the campsite fiasco, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Pierce and her HOA cronies were cooking up something big. Tuesday morning, I drove to the county records office, a squat brick building where Mrs. Lopez, the clerk, had known my family forever. She greeted me with a warm smile that faded when I told her why I was there. The HOA says my Northfield isn't mine anymore, I said, spreading my deed on the counter. I need to see the official records. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, then slowed. This doesn't look right, she muttered after an hour of digging through files. There's a note from 2009 about a boundary adjustment, but the paperwork's gone. My stomach dropped. Gone how? She frowned. It was logged, but the physical docs aren't here. That's rare. I leaned in. Who checked the file last? She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Judge Bradley Pierce's clerk, about a month ago. Bradley Pierce, Margaret's husband. The dots were connecting, and they spelled trouble. I spent 6 hours there, poring over dusty ledgers and digital scans with Mrs. Lopez. We found more. 3 years back, the property maps had shifted, shrinking my land by a chunk labeled Municipal Adjustment per Code 47.3. When I asked about that code, she couldn't find it anywhere. This needed a public hearing, she whispered, glancing around the empty room. Did you get any notices? Not a peep, I said. She shook her head. Something's fishy, Daniel. Driving home, my hand shook on the wheel. Judge Pierce had been county records administrator 3 years ago, right when those maps changed. Back at the farm, I dug into Granddad's old chest again, pulling out irrigation maps. I owned the water rights to the creek feeding that field, separate from the land title. If they thought they could rewrite my boundaries, they'd forgotten about the water. That was my ace in hole. That night, Sarah Miller slipped over, looking jumpy. Daniel, it's worse than we thought, she said, keeping her voice low. I overheard Margaret on the phone with a developer. They're not just after your field for camping. They want to build luxury glamping cabins, charge big fees to residents. My jaw tightened. Commercialize my land? She nodded. And Judge Pierce is pulling strings to fast-track it. Approvals, permits, he's in deep. Why tell me this? I asked, won't it get you in hot water? Sarah's eyes hardened. They've made life hell for anyone who doesn't toe the line. Last month, they fined the Clarks $500 for overgrown grass while they were at a funeral. I'm done watching them bully people. We stood there in the dark, rain starting to patter on the roof, and I felt a fire light inside me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. Wednesday evening, I walked into the HOA meeting with Tom, clutching my tax records and photos. The room was packed, residents glaring at me like I was the villain. Margaret sat up front with her board, including Ed Callahan, a retired banker who'd hassled me before about his grandkid's dog chasing my chickens. We'll start with the Harper issue, Margaret announced, her voice syrupy. He claims we've encroached on his land with our campsite. It's not a claim, it's fact, I said, standing tall. She slid a paper across the table. This 2008 agreement, signed by you, gives us recreational rights to your Northfield for water access. Tom snatched it up, and I leaned in. My name was there, sure, but the signature? Not mine, close, but the loops were off. That's not my signature, I said loud enough for the room to hear. Ed scoffed. You accusing us of forgery, Harper? That's bold. Tom cut in. Where's the notary seal? Property transfers need one. Margaret's smile twitched. It was informal back then. We kept records. Informal agreements don't hold up legally. Tom shot back. And Daniel's got tax receipts showing he's paid on that land. No HOA money involved. I laid out my records, but Margaret waved them off. He paid taxes. We maintained usage rights. Standard practice. Standard. I snapped, losing it. You're stealing my land. Ed stood, red-faced. We need space for our families. Your empty field's perfect. Why fight it? Because it's mine, I roared. I grow wheat there. It's not yours to take. An older woman, Mrs. Patel, spoke up from the back. That field'd been Harper land since before Crestwood existed. Margaret glared. Personal stories don't count, Mrs. Patel. The meeting turned into a shouting match until Sarah caught my eye and nodded toward the door. Tom called for a break, and outside, Sarah whispered, "They're planning a big barbecue this weekend on your field. County officials, the works. It's a power play." I stared at her, rain soaking my jacket. "They're not stopping, are they?" She shook her head. "Not unless you make them." As we headed back in, I knew photos and tax stubs wouldn't cut it. I needed something bigger, and I was starting to see how the land itself might fight back.